everybody, it's Emily at Arg Schooling, and today I want to talk about 10 books to get to know me. The last week or so on Instagram, there's been a lot of those 6 movies to get to know me, 6 musicals to get to know me, 6 songs. There's just been a lot of that. So I've been thinking about what books would help you get to know me. Now, if you've been following me for any amount of time, I don't think anything I'm going to share today will be a surprise. But if you're new here, then I hope that these books will help you get to know me a little better. And hey, if you're not new here, if you've been here for a while, let's talk about the books that I love, that I've been gushing about for years. So let's kick it off with what I would probably consider my favorite book of all time, because this is the book that I think people associate the most with me, the book that I think I recommend the most, or that I talk about the most. I'm going to give you 5 seconds to guess. It's The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. This book is one that I literally think about almost every single day. I don't know what that says about me as a human, but I think about this book all of the time. I think about the characters. They might as well be real people to me because I feel like they are. I've read this book so many times that I basically know it by heart. And it lives in my heart. This is a story about World War II. It's a story about a girl named Liesel who has suffered some trauma. She is being sent to live with this German couple, the Hubermans, and her mother is gone. She doesn't know what happened to her. Her little brother dies on the way to the Hubermans, so she's dealing with all of this trauma, and the Hubermans take her in. Hans Huberman is one of my favorite people. And like I said, he might as well be real to me, so he's one of my favorite humans. The story is narrated by Death, and this book makes me want to read more things like that, where you have an interesting narration. The thing that I love about this story is how powerful it is about storytelling, about the power of reading, the power of words. But also, one of the things that I love the most is the character of Max. Because most of my life, I've read a lot of books about the Holocaust. I've read a lot of books about Jewish suffering in that time period. And most of them, not all of them, most of them portray the Jews as being docile, as being just, this is their fate, and accepting it, and, just dying. The fact that Max is in hiding, but also dreams of fighting, and he thinks about, his boxing is his life, and he thinks so much about, fighting back. The way his character is just angry, but also he's not resigned to this fate. He wants nothing more than to live and survive, and he'll do whatever he has to do so. I just think that was such a powerful character, and it's something that I think made the book just so much better for me, just elevated it. I'm not doing a great job explaining this book, but also it's just such a beautifully told and heartbreaking story. I have read this book, I don't even know, maybe 15, 16 times, and I still sob, uncontrollable crying every single time. For me, that's a powerful book. To have read it this many times and it still hurts me, I know what's going to happen. Death freaking prepares you, the whole book, for what's going to happen. I know, and it still breaks me every time. Number 2 would be Watership Down by Richard Adams. I just think this is such a underrated classic that I cannot stop talking about it because I want more people to read it. I think when people think of classic literature, they don't think about things like this, but I think Watership Down is absolutely an important classic that everyone should read. This is a story about rabbits, but it's also a story about the hero's journey and going on this Odyssey-like adventure where we have to learn to face the things that we're afraid of. We have to learn to become the leader. And how does one get a group of scared rabbits to follow him into the unknown and go to battle against villains? And like, it's just such a great story. Like, not only that, but the fact that Richard Adams created realistic rabbit characters, gave them mythology, a language, and lore that all makes sense to, like, that's the kind of storytelling I'm here for. I want to read books where I feel like this person spent way too much time thinking about rabbits. Every time I read it, I feel like I get something new out of it. And this is another book that I have read so many times, dozens of times, and it always feels fresh and new every single time. Number 3, again unsurprising, is Lord of the Rings. I would say this is a story I have known my entire life. I didn't fully read it until I think I was either 18 or 19 years old, was when I finished the trilogy for the first time. But I'd known the story prior to that because it's my mother's favorite. And I don't know, somehow I feel like she just like put it into me from birth. Like, I just knew it. And I don't know how to explain that. I had, of course, seen The Hobbit and read The Hobbit younger, but, and like the Hobbit cartoon movie. But I just, this is a story that I feel is formative for me. And it's funny because I would not consider myself a fantasy reader. I don't read a lot of like high fantasy. I feel, and I think a part of that is because so much of it feels like they are trying to create their own version of Lord of the Rings, and I just, to me, I can't see past that to enjoy the story. So for me, I'm not what I would say I would call a fantasy reader, but I feel like the Lord of the Rings is just like such an important story to my reading life. Like, I don't know, I've read it again so many times. I'm reading it again right now with my youngest, and we're listening to the audiobooks this time. And let me just say that the Andy Serkis audio narration is stellar. Like, it's so good. He does all the voices so well. And one of the things that I love about it is that, I don't know if he did it intentionally or not, but all of his voices, almost all of his voices, I would say Elrond is the exception so far, sound like the movie characters. So like his Pippin and Merry are so like I feel like I'm listening to Billy Boyd and Dominic Monaghan. Like, I can hear their voices, and I'm just like, wow, that's a good impression. He does Sean Bean really well. His Gandalf is spot on. So like, I feel like if you love the movies and you want to experience the books but you're intimidated by them, listen to the Andy Serkis Lord of the Rings audiobooks. They're great. Okay, this next one is one that's newer to me, but I have to include it. And that is Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. Project Hail Mary is on this list because this gives the definition of what I love in science fiction. I am a science fiction reader. I've read, I wouldn't say a ton in that genre, but I have read a fair amount, and the thing that I feel like I love the most about this genre is when authors choose to spin it in a positive way. And what I mean by that is, so much science fiction is like Independence Day, where we're being invaded by aliens and they're evil and they want to kill us, and we have to fight against them, or that kind of story. And I mean, I'm not saying I don't enjoy that. There have been plenty of stories like that that I have gotten into, but what I love the most when it comes to science fiction is rather when we learn to work together with another species, with other people, when everyone comes together to solve a problem. And it's kind of what I would call cozy sci-fi. Feel-good sci-fi, where it's all going in a positive way. There's intense moments, there's peril, sure, but in the end, we all come together to save the day. This book does it in such a great way. The main character is so entertaining to follow. I also really like how Andy Weir writes his science fiction to be like as scientifically accurate as possible. Like, I'm not smart enough to know if he is actually being completely accurate. I've been told he is. Some of it goes right over my head, but I like the idea that he's not just making stuff up. Like, this is real science and this would work this way. I don't know. I think this is just a great example of my favorite kind of science fiction. So I have to include Project Hail Mary on that list. Now, if we're going to talk about formative literature, books that like really made me who I am today, I have to talk about Stephen King. And if I have to talk about Stephen King, I'm going to talk about my favorite Stephen King, which is It. This is a book I read probably way too young, but honestly, who didn't? I read this, I think, when I was either 11 or 12. I feel like I might have been 12, maybe even 13, somewhere in there. I was in middle school for sure. But this book kind of blew my mind. And I think, again, kind of like Watership Down, it made me think, who thinks about this kind of stuff in this much detail? Like, who comes up with all of this? I just thought that was amazing, that not only did he create this engaging story about these characters, but he built an entire lore around a town, like the history going back to its founding. Like, that's wild to me. Like, who thinks that much stuff? Like, who creates a story like that? Stephen King, obviously. But I just feel like, for me, this book was like foundational in making me a horror fan. Like, I had read other horror novels prior to this. I was a big fan of John Saul. I was a big fan of Christopher Pike back then. But this was the first book I read that was like, this is probably not for children. It's the first book I read where I felt like I might get in trouble for reading it. I knew I wouldn't really, but like, I wasn't sure 100% that I was supposed to be reading it, which made it all the more exciting. And I just, it holds up. I've reread this book so many times over the years, and every single time I still get that blown away feeling. It's such a powerful story, not just about overcoming your fears, but about friendship, about like growing up and like how those friendships change as you get older, how you view the world, how your fears change as you grow up. I don't know. It's such a beautiful piece of literature. I almost feel like it ought to be a classic, even though I know it never will, because it's horror. It's not a real story, you know, it's not academic, but it should be. Like, I feel like it's a masterclass in creating amazing storytelling. Like, it's just so good. All of the characters are, it's quintessential Stephen King. Like, if you only ever read one Stephen King novel, you have to read it. For something completely different, let's go to number 6. It's Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. I went back and forth between Little Women and Anne of Green Gables, and I decided to go with Little Women. While I love Anne, I have never finished the entire series. And granted, I know there's more books about the March family. I think there's like Little Men. I've never read that either. But like Little Women, I would say, is a foundational book for me. I think I read it the first time when I was like maybe 10 or 11. And I desperately wanted to be a March sister. Like, I feel like I relate to Lori the most because I just wanted to be a part of that family. Like, let me be an honorary March. I always wanted a sister. I always felt like I was missing out on having a sister. I have a little brother. Not the same. Like, I wanted that, like, deep bond that sisters have. And, like, I don't know. I love the March family. And I love that this book is so different for the time period that it's set in. Like, I know people sometimes say, oh, but it's very Christian. Is it? like, I don't know, I, a Jewish girl, read it growing up, and it never occurred to me that, like, it was a Christian story. So I don't think that it is. Does it get a little preachy sometimes? Sure. But to me, that's just like, that's the time period they lived in. That's how people were back then. But like, I just think the way that these girls were raised in that time period is just so like feminist. I love that each sister is so different and they each want such different things in their lives, but they are still like, they all love each other so deeply. I loved the sister bond so much. Like, I just loved each and every one of them. For the record, my favorite Little Women adaptation is the 1990s Winona Ryder. It is the only one that I think is worth rewatching over and over. I did like the newest one that just came out, the Greta Gerwig one. I didn't hate that. I really liked what they did with Joe's character in that one, but for me, the quintessential Little Women experience would be the 1990s Winona Ryder. There was a period of time where I would stop the movie when Laurie proposed to Joe and she turned him down because like I was so mad at her. It's like, how could you possibly say no to him? I mean, I understand it now. Makes sense now. I get it. But also, like, do you see him? He's beautiful. Christian Bale is just... Next, I want to talk about another foundational book, The Diary of Anne Frank. I, again, read this when I was probably about 11 or 12, and I just, like, felt like I knew her. I felt like I was reading about a person that I knew. I felt that we would be friends, and, like, I wanted to know her better. And I read this book several times in my youth, and I just felt like she was a person that if I were to have been alive then, we would have been best friends. I felt like we were very similar in so many ways, and that like we had so much in common. Like I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that she was taken from us, and like I still get mad thinking about like what she might have become. Like Anne was special and important, and I am still to this day very angry that she's not with us anymore. Like I feel like she would have been something, and I wish we could have had the chance to find out what. But Anne was just very important to me. When I was in high school, I was on the forensics team, and if you don't know what that is, that's like public speaking, but also acting. And what I was doing in forensics was the prose. Sometimes I did duo, but my senior year, I did Anne Frank. And I pulled together my favorite passages. I put the whole thing together myself. And that was the first time I ever went to state. And I was so proud of myself. But like, I felt like I was I was Anne. Like, she was coming into my body and we were performing it together. But it just meant a lot to me. And she still means a lot to me. Next is another one I'm pretty sure everyone is expecting to be on this list, because who would I be if I didn't talk about it? And that's the Arc of the Scythe series by Neil Shusterman. I loved this trilogy. It's, I think, maybe Neil Shusterman's best work. And I haven't read everything he's written, but I've read a bunch, and so far I don't think I've read anything that he's written that is as interesting or as powerful as the Arc of the Scythe trilogy. This series is about humanity. What if we were immortal? What would that look like? What if, like, there was nothing that could kill us except scythes? And that is state ordained murder. And like the only way you can really die is if a scythe kills you. And they have to kill you because they have to keep the population under control, because that's the only way you can. Because there's no more sickness, there's no more oops, you got in a car crash or you overdosed on drugs or anything like that. Like, people for fun splat themselves because it's the only way you can have that adrenaline feeling, you know? because you don't even feel pain. You get these nanites put in your body, and like they prevent any kind of sickness. They prevent you from feeling any kind of pain. So like, what does that do to humanity is an interesting question, especially since like in this world, there's not even government. It's just the thunderhead. The cloud has become sentient, and now it runs everything, and it runs everything with no bias, with no like malice. It's completely neutral. And I just think that concept is so interesting, like endlessly interesting. I think about this series all the time. And like, what could that happen? What would it look like if it did? Like, I'm ready for the nanites. Like, I would love that. Let me not have pain anymore. Sounds great. But I just think the characters in this book are so compelling, and like the way the Scythedom works, and like how can you really be completely neutral when it comes to murdering people? Like, how does that work? And how can you, like, I can't even fathom like learning the art of murder and figuring out like what's the best way to kill people in the humanest possible way while, you know, meeting my quota. Like, I don't know. The whole series is so good. It also talks a lot about like religion and how religions come into being. Like the last book especially just like blew my mind. Like reading about how this it's great. It's his magnum opus. Like, I think everyone should read that series just because I want to talk to people about it. I feel like I just always want to talk about it. This next one might throw some of you off, but I have to include it, and that is the Walking Dead comics. I have read a lot of graphic novels up to now, but those were the first ones I ever really read. I used to think I didn't like graphic novels. I used to think I couldn't read them because I found them confusing. I found the pictures and like it was all distracting, and I didn't know what to look at, and I found myself unable to read them. So I'd kind of dismissed comics and graphic novels for years. But when we started watching The Walking Dead, and I was like, wow, this is based on stories. I want to read them. And so I started reading them, and like it took me a while. Like it took me a long time to like adjust to it and get used to it. But once I did, I read the entirety of the Walking Dead comics, and that's a lot. That's a lot of comics. But it's the series that made me love that genre. Like or that medium. I found that that's a really compelling way to tell a story. And I've read so many more because of the Walking Dead comics. So while The Walking Dead may not be like the best I've read in that genre, like it's what made me get into reading graphic novels. So I have to put it on my list. Also, like, I mean, it's really good stuff. Like if the only thing you know of The Walking Dead is the TV show, I think the comics are so much better. I did like the TV show for the first like handful of seasons, but then it just, I don't know, it went off the rails and got really dragged down and bogged down in like the same story over and over. The comics do it so much better and so much more succinct. Like, you don't get stuck in a story longer than you should be, which I feel like is what happened with the show. But the comic books are really good. And I never even finished the TV series. I don't know what happens there, but the ending in the comics could in no way ever make sense to what they've done to the show. If, you know, like, the comics are better. And the last book I want to talk about is The Golem and the Jinni by Helene Wecker. I just think this book was so good, and it's another one that I think about regularly. I've never read the sequel though, because part of me is kind of afraid that I won't like it. Because sometimes you love a book so much that you don't necessarily want any more. Kind of like The Hunger Games. I love The Hunger Games, but I did not enjoy The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I don't think we needed it. I don't understand why it was written. So like, I'm afraid to read the sequel to The Golem and the Jinni. I own it. I have it. I just haven't picked it up yet. So if anyone's read it, let me know if I'm going to want to read it or not. I'm kind of scared. But The Golem and the Jinni is such a powerful story. And it's so interesting the way the author has used mythology to like tell this tale. It's intricate, it's beautifully written and heartwarming, and I just find it just so compelling. This is a story about a golem named Chava who comes to New York City. She was on a boat with the man she was created for, but he dies on the ship, and so now she's been left on her own. Now, if you know anything about golems, you know that they are created to protect their master, whoever created them. So they're made to be like a servant, basically. And so when she's left on her own, she doesn't really know what to do or who to go to or how to be. So that right there is such a compelling, like watching her kind of work this out and find her place in the world. But you are also following this Jinni who his story entwines with hers, and like they're called to each other because like they're both these creatures who are out of place in the world. And I find their friendship so beautiful, and the way the author created this web of story, it's just, again, I'm always amazed. Like, I could never. I would love to be a writer, but I could never. Like, I don't understand how people think these things and like create these insanely intricate plots. Like, I could never. So, I mean, I just think this book is beautiful. And again, it's one that I'm like, everyone should read this because I want everyone to read it so I can talk to you about it. So those are 10 books to get to know me. I hope you know me a little bit better now as a reader. And I would love to hear from you. What books do we have in common? Let me know down in the comments. Like, if you had to give like your one recommendation to me, one book that you love, that you think I should read, let me know that down below in the comments. I would love to hear about that. So yeah, let me know if we have any books in common, if we are bookish best friends. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I hope that you'll subscribe and also hit the like button. It really does help me out. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys in my next video. Happy reading. Bye.